Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. This evening I want to talk about the factor Upadana, one of the factors of the dependent origination, the four kinds of Upadana. Upadana is generally translated as clinging, and in the sequence of the dependent origination it goes sense contact, because of sense contact feeling, because of feeling craving, because of craving clinging, because of clinging becoming. Upadana is more literally rendered as fuel, the fuel for becoming. When tanha, craving, occurs, it occurs in one of three modes. This is tanha. It's either desire, craving, or thirst for sense pleasure, meaning sense experience that is pleasant. And this would also include the negative form, the desire to avoid unpleasant sense experience. The second form of craving is the craving for becoming, bhava tanha. And the third kind is its polar opposite, the craving for not becoming or not being, vibhava tanha. These are the three kinds of craving. And because of craving, clinging, or fuel, upadana, craving tanha is, in its own essence, it's a fairly simple, primitive kind of mental impulse. It's just, I want or I don't want. It's not much elaboration involved. But if it's indulged in, then it inevitably leads to the elaboration into upadana, which in a general way can be described as when craving becomes a project. It's a more elaborate mental state, and it has more nuance than craving. And we talk about four kinds of upadana. There is the clinging to sense experience, the clinging to personality view, the clinging to views and opinions, and the clinging to rites and rituals. First observation to make is that three of the four have something to do with view. And the first one has to do with sense experience. So the craving for sense experience elaborates into the clinging to sense experience. And this is a very natural mode of mental activity for human beings and other beings in the sense desire sphere. Our experience, our psychology is dominated by the senses. For the desire for pleasant sight, sounds, smells, touches, and tastes, and the loathing of unpleasant sights, smells, sounds, and tastes. For those beings in the animal realm, their mental life doesn't reach much beyond that. And even for the human beings, most of the time we're defaulting to that mode of mentality. And this is the factor that keeps us limited to the kamabhumi, the plane of sense desire, the lowest plane of consciousness. As long as we're caught in the sense desire mode, then we don't transcend or escape that realm of experience. It's even difficult for beings that are grounded in that form of experience. It's even hard for them to imagine an alternative. It's hard for them to imagine something beyond the sense desire realm or layer of consciousness. And we become very, very attached to our physical comforts and our experiences and our pleasures, and we're very fearful of unpleasant experience. But this is, although it's the noisiest level of craving and of clinging, it's relatively superficial because there are deeper layers of craving below sense desire. But as long as we're completely absorbed in sense desire, then we can't even begin to get a glimmer of what lies underneath. But what lies underneath is the more primordial, fundamental desires to be and not to be. Bhavatanha and vibhavatanha. The desire to expand our being, to be greater, to be more than we are. Or the polar opposite, the desire to be less, to annihilate our consciousness, to escape into oblivion. And until one is fully awakened, there will be these desires alternating, operating in the course of the mind. And these forms of craving serve to direct and formulate the types of upadana or clinging that relate to views. It's to be noted that of these three, two of them also in this list also occur as the lower samyojana, the fetters, the mental states that are transcended by stream entry, the three lower fetters. And those are personality view, Sakaya Ditti, rites and rituals clinging, Silabhata Paramata, and skeptical doubt, Vicikiccha. So again, we see the importance of views, and this is one aspect or one way of understanding the nature of stream entry is a purification of view. It's the opening of the Dhamma eye. So the three upadanas that are based on views work in the opposite direction. They feed into more becoming. They solidify the grip of samsara. Sakaya Ditti, personality view, the literal translation would be own body view. is the cognitive form of a self-view. It's the implicit or explicit idea of an identity, of a self. And it can be, probably is in most cases, just implicit. It's just assumed. But it can also be explicit when we develop philosophies and thought, elaborated thought forms around the idea of a self. Whether we call this self ego or Atman or Jiva or soul or personality or identity, these are all variations on a theme. At this level, Sakaya Ditti, this is on the level of view, so it's cognitive, so it's an identification. We have many, many ways in which we assume an identity. We have all these secondary characteristics that we can latch onto and claim to have an identity, beginning with a name. And with the proper understanding of Dhamma, we see that all identity is constructed. It's a mental formation, and it only has a provisional, conventional, or utilitarian value. It doesn't have a existential or metaphysical or ontological reality. It's not grounded in anything absolute. But we take it as such. We're fooled by our own identity that we have, our name, our nationality, our occupation, our age, our gender, many, many qualities, factors that we can identify with and take as components of an identity, rather than seeing these all as conditional processes subject to cause and effect. Now this way of thinking, organizing the mental contents around the nucleus of a self, is one of the main ways we find ourselves falling into suffering. Because thinking in this way, then we always have something to lose. The self is something to be protected. It's something that's threatened. We feel hurt if someone insults or denigrates the self or any component of the identity, because we identify with that self. We identify with one or the other components of self. We can identify with the body, and then when illness or injury threatens the body and ultimately the body is going to die, then this is felt as suffering, because there's an identification with self. It's the same with all the other mental factors. They're all actually subject to change, subject to conditionality, and there's no place in there that we can find an absolute identity, a self to latch onto. This is the purpose of the Zen koan, what was your original face before you were born? Or another variation is, what was your original face before your mother and father were born? What is the essence of a being? No essence can be found. This is something that's worth contemplating again and again, that there is no own essence. There's no svabhava. Nothing exists from its own side. And when we identify with a self, then we're just identifying with a fictitious mental structure. It only has a conventional purpose. It's a very rough approximation that we can use for navigating in the world, but if we're fooled into believing in it, if it becomes a cognitive reality in our mind, then it leads into suffering. The form of Upadana called Silabata Paramasa is one that is often, I think, misunderstood, because, as very often the case, is a problem of translation. Rite and ritual clinging is neither very literal, nor is it really get to the heart of things. People hear that and they think, well, I don't have rite and ritual clinging. I don't sacrifice goats, so I'm okay. Rites and rituals doesn't really even come into the language. It's silabata is sila is ethics, morality, and vata, which becomes the V becomes B just because of the orthographical rules of combining letters, but vata is duties. So silabata is actually the do's and don'ts, and what you should not do. The precepts tell you what you should not do, and vata is an expression of the duties, the things that ought to be done. So no one would say that we should not have sila and vata. That's not the point of it either. Paramata means reliance on, dependence on. And what the whole compound together is pointing to is that one should not have a mechanistic view of the practice. One should not rely on just a codified set of do's and don'ts to reach liberation. This is the avoidance of a superstitious attitude towards the Dhamma or towards practice. Not having silabata paramasa means that one has a mind that's free. And this applies very much to the practice of meditation itself. And this is something that you find sometimes spoken of in the Thai forest tradition, is the monks that have been raised up in that tradition. They tend to be rather critical or skeptical of more formal meditation systems because of this danger of silabata paramasa. And it's a difficult concept to really get a hold of and to find the right balance, because the other extreme is to be completely free form, and then one doesn't get anywhere. It's just self-indulgence. That meditation certainly requires a high degree of inner discipline. A good place to begin thinking about this is the Buddha's parable of the raft. That a traveler, a wanderer, comes to a river, and in order to cross the river, he builds a raft of bamboo and lashes it together and sets off across the river. And when he gets to the other side, does he take the raft and carry it on his back as he climbs onto the shore? No, he lets it go. It's done its purpose, and now he carries on without it. But you see the full picture here. It's also equally unwise to take the raft halfway across the river, then start breaking it up there. It doesn't make any sense either. So the raft has its purpose. And disciplined forms of meditation, whatever kind one takes up, is just that. It's a technique. It's a method for getting the mind into the right conducive mode. We talk about vipassana as a kind of meditation, and there are different techniques of vipassana out there. Mahasi technique, Goenka technique, Pa'ak technique. And you notice most of these come out of Burma. Their civilization has really focused on developing these techniques of meditation. And people who become practitioners of one of these forms of meditation, they speak about that as vipassana. And that's really a confusion of the nomenclature. The vipassana is not any particular form of meditation. It's a state of mind. It's a way of holding the mind. And these methods are skillful means for accessing that state of mind, of clear, precise equanimity, fully awake, fully calm, fully alert, and very sharp and precise in navigating the stream of mental events. And however you get there, that's useful and skillful. But in the deep states of meditation, it can become a hindrance to cling to a technique. It's a form of attachment. It's holding onto the raft as you climb onto the shore. So Silabbata Paramasa is a form of clinging. As we're clinging to procedures, we're clinging to systems and methods, and this is obviously a form of views, of holding on to views. And the last form of Upadana is the general Upadana of views, Ditthi Upadana. The Buddha spoke about the dangers of clinging to views often. It's something very pernicious, very negative for the development of the mind, is to be attached to fixed views. The Buddha in the Digha Nikaya, there's a couple of parables that he gives about attachment to views. One of these, and they're similar, but they make a similar point. But one of these stories is a man is coming home from a journey, a kind of trip, and he's walking through countryside, and he sees a big pile of cow dung. And cow dung in ancient India was something that I think still even in rural India today is something that's considered useful. It's not waste. It's useful for many things. And he saw this cow dung and he thought, "Oh, this is a good find, fresh cow dung." And he wrapped it up in a piece of cloth and he said, "This will serve when I get back for fodder for my pigs." And he made a bundle with a piece of cloth and put it on his head in the Indian fashion, carried it along as he went back to his home village. And after he traveled a few miles, it starts to rain. And then it starts to rain more heavily. And pretty soon that bundle on his head is soaked. And it's all dripping and drizzling down. It soils and fouls his clothes and his hair, and it's just a mess. And as he gets into his home village, the little kids start laughing at him. And he gets angry. He says, you may laugh, but I've carried this cow dung a long way and I'm not giving it up now." And he said, this is like one who's attached to views, and when the views become counterproductive, then one should just toss them aside. But there's a tendency in the mind to say, well, I've held on to this opinion for a long time and I'm not going to be easily shaken of it. There's a similar story about two fellows traveling together, and they come to an abandoned village and they find a pile of firewood sticks. And so they say, oh, these firewood sticks will be useful when we get home. Let's gather them up. So they gather up the firewood sticks and carry them and proceed on their way. And a little further, they come across some bolts of cloth. And the one fellow says, oh, this cloth is much more valuable than firewood sticks. And he throws the sticks away and he takes the bolts of cloth. But the first fellow says, you do as you like, friend, but as for me, I've carried these sticks a long way and I'm loath to give up on them now. And as they go along, they proceed further and further. They keep finding more and more valuable things, even up to silver, gold, and jewels. And the one fellow, just whatever he has a bundle of silver, and then he sees gold. He says, oh, that's better than silver. And he tosses the silver aside and picks up the gold. The other fellow's, well, he's carried his sticks a real long way now. He's not going to, doesn't want to give those up. He's carried them so far. So they get back to their home village, and the one fellow has a bundle full of precious jewels, and he lives like a Maharaja for the rest of his life, and the other fellow has enough firewood sticks to cook his porridge the next morning. And this is the given explicitly by the Buddha as saying, attachment to views. And what is interesting about this story, a point that should be contemplated, is he praised the fellow who changed his bundle constantly and came home with jewels. He didn't say that the person should come home empty-handed. So he's not saying you should not have views. Someone who doesn't have views and opinions is kind of an idiot. You have to hold your views lightly, not be attached to them, and not let them become a source of quarreling. Not be rigid and fixed in the views. Be open to other opinions. And this applies to all kinds of views and opinions, whether it's culture, art, politics, whatever it might be. But what is particularly meant in the Buddhist context with views is philosophical views about the nature of reality. In the Brahmajala Sutta, there's a discourse on views. There's 61 wrong views. It's a schema organized, analyzing the different views, philosophical views that were prevalent in India at the time. There's a Buddhist scholar from the mid-20th century, Jayantaleki, who wrote a book, Early Buddhist Theory of Knowledge. And a large part of that book is an analysis of this sutta. And he makes a very interesting, sound case that these 61 views don't represent just an arbitrary scheme, but they actually correlate to real schools of thought in ancient India. He identifies as many of them as possible. But they can be organized, and they are organized into a kind of a matrix, a scheme. And the whole thing can be simplified into, let's say, 2.5 wrong views. The two primary wrong views are eternalism and annihilationism, Susattavada and Uccedavada. Eternalism is the view that and this then connects back to the idea of a self. It's the view of an eternal, unchanging self. in Indian philosophical language, the Atman. And there are different variations on this theme. And this is why you get 61 views, because there's variations on all of these, like subtleties. But usually when you have a eternalist view, it goes along with the assumption of a creator God. That's the most common form of this, that everyone has a fixed soul or self, an Atman, and these originate from some primal source or first cause. The other view is the annihilationist view, which is, in modern language, we would call it materialism or physicalism. The idea that only matter is real, that mind is just matter in motion. In the modern form, it's neurons firing in the brain, and that upon death, the being is totally annihilated. There's no continuity of any sort. And this too has, variations. There's various permutations of this view. And these two views are, in the world, they're opposites, and they're often antagonists. One modern form of this is creationism versus evolution. Right? We see it all throughout history. There's a tension between these two views. But from the Buddhist perspective, they share, although they seem like total opposites, they share one fundamental wrong assumption, that they allow arbitrariness or randomness into their philosophy, which primary principle of Buddhist philosophy is nothing arises without a cause or condition. There is no randomness, there is no arbitrariness. So in the eternalist view, everything goes back to the arbitrary will of the Creator. If you ask why things are this way, that way, you can only take it so far, then you have to say because God did it. In the materialist view, it falls back on arbitrariness or randomness. Things are just the way they are because that's the way they are. And there's no real, nothing beyond a random arising chance occurrences. And the Buddha put the middle path between these two as a dependent origination. This is one of the uses the Buddha makes of the term middle path. The middle path of dependent origination between the two extreme views. There's a modern Buddhist writer who came up with a simile or an image to illustrate this middle path. Is if you have a round lake and there's an island in the dead center of the middle of the lake, standing on either shore of the lake and looking at the island, it'll always appear to be closer to the far shore. And he says this is like the eternalist looking at the island, which is the Punnadhammo, looking at that island. He sees it as being close to the far shore. He sees it as being close to materialism. And this is what Christian theologians critiquing Buddhism, they say it's nihilistic. It's by denying God, then Buddhists fall into the same category as the atheists. But if you go around to the other side of the lake, the materialist or the atheist looking at the island, he sees it as close to the far shore, and he says, well, Buddhism is really no better than any of these other religions. It's full of concepts like rebirth and karma, and it's all mystical nonsense. So whichever shore of the lake you're standing on, the island seems closer to the further shore. Also, another way of looking at that middle path is it's like a razor's edge. Changing metaphors completely now. It's like a razor's edge. It's very difficult to walk the middle path and not fall off one side or the other. And we see this in Buddhist history. and different thinkers in Buddhist history, the tendency has been to fall off one way or the other, that become a little bit too eternalist and let some kind of self-image or God image creep into it, or to fall off into the side of nihilism and atheism. So this is, views. And the half view is the eel-wriggler view. That's a literal translation from the Pali, the eel-wriggler view, and that's what we would call in modern philosophical language agnosticism. And some modern writers have wanted to portray the Buddha as being agnostic, but actually the Buddha was very dismissive of agnosticism as the eel-wrigglers. And his descriptions of them, he's making fun of them. He says when you ask them a question, they say, well, it might be like this, or it might be like that, or it might be the other, and I can't say it's this, and I can't say it's that. It's impossible to determine. And he goes on a long paragraph of these sort of weaseling words. And he says, one holds this view for two reasons, either out of fear or stupidity. So it's quite critical of that, that kind of agnostic attitude. And the Buddha also cautioned against holding even his own teachings dogmatically as a view. And the analogy is grasping it wrongly, like a kusa grass. This sharp, stiff grass that, if grasped correctly, it's wonderful stuff. You can weave thatch out of it. It's very useful. But if you grasp it the wrong way, it'll cut your hand. So the Buddha said, even these teachings of mine, if they're wrongly grasped, they'll cut your hand like a piece of kusa grass. There's nothing to be gained by holding dogmatically to any teaching. The mind has to hold the teachings with saddha, with faith, but not with dogmatic adherence. Which is again another subtle middle path to find and to walk. One aspect of this is not to assume that you understand it all. There's always further unfoldment, further understanding possible. And this is something to be cautioned against in the spiritual life, is to ever think you've got it all figured out. The mind wants certainty, it craves certainty. And so it'll very often settle on a formula or a definition and hold on to it. Oh, this is that. And if you do that, then you close off the possibility of further unfoldment in that direction. It's far more useful spiritually to have good questions than to have sound answers, to have definitive answers, to have the mind in an open state of question. And this is completely different from doubt or skepticism. This is openness of mind. This is freedom of mind. This is again coming back to avoiding Silabhata Paramasa. So these are the four kinds of clinging, just to sum up. There's the clinging to sense desire, the clinging to personality view, the clinging to rites and rituals, and the clinging to views. And when any of these are followed, they lead to a rigidity of the mind and a crystallization of the idea of self, of a duality comes into being of self and other. This is how one creates a self and becomes a self and then inevitably suffers. So be vigilant and keep watching the mind for sliding into various forms of clinging.
And Mayam Dhammakataya Sadhu Kalam Dadamase Sadhu 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 Anumodami